At the end of the 19th century, Europe still looked very much like the paintings we see in museums: halls of mirrors, portraits of ancestors, uniforms loaded with medals, crowns carefully kept in velvet-lined display cases. On the outside, everything still seemed solid, ancient, almost eternal. But if you moved a little closer, if you stopped looking at the gleam of gold and focused on the account books, the picture changed completely. Ceilings beginning to leak, properties mortgaged, servants quietly dismissed, jewels discreetly sold in Paris or London to pay overdue debts. Europe still had the great family names: dukes from old lines, counts whose lineage went back to centuries of crusades, royal houses that boasted family trees impossible to memorize. What it no longer had, at least not as before, was steady money. Agriculture was ceasing to be the engine of wealth it had once been. The industrial revolutions had shifted the economic center of gravity toward factories, trains, and banks, and many aristocrats did not know how to adapt. They kept living as if the world had not changed, while the world was changing at full speed. On the other side of the Atlantic, the scene was almost the opposite. On the east coast of the United States, cities like New York or Chicago were filling up with chimneys, railroad tracks, and bank offices. In just a few decades, families that had started from nothing accumulated fortunes that easily surpassed the annual incomes of many European kingdoms. Where Europe had paintings of ancestors, the United States had blueprints for new mansions. Where Europe inherited titles, the United States signed contracts. In neighborhoods like New York's Fifth Avenue or in the summer mansions of Newport, houses appeared that looked like palaces: marble staircases, dining rooms capable of seating dozens of guests, electricity when it was still a novelty, bathrooms with hot water, music rooms, conservatories, all of it designed to impress. But unlike their European equivalents, those mansions did not come with centuries of history attached. There was no such and such duke or such and such count at the end of the family name. Just a man who, one generation earlier, might have been an unknown entrepreneur, a hated speculator, or an admired businessman, depending on whom you asked. There lay the key to the clash. Europe had prestige without liquidity. The United States had liquidity without prestige. On one side of the ocean, crowns and coats of arms abounded, but banknotes were scarce. On the other, banknotes were plentiful, but something less tangible was missing: the social recognition of the traditional elites. And caught in the middle of that imbalance, without having chosen it, were these young women, the daughters of those new fortunes, carefully educated, prepared to speak French at the table, to play the piano, to recite poetry, and to present themselves with a flawless smile to any guest. Little by little, a term began to emerge that summed it all up. In English, they were called dollar princesses, heiresses whose American fortunes not only served to build mansions, but to rescue European castles in trouble. Their dowries, those enormous sums that accompanied marriage, became the lifeline for more than one noble house. In exchange, they obtained something that in the United States could not be bought directly: a title, a place in the family tree of old Europe, the right to have their names appear alongside those surnames that for generations had looked down on the newcomers. On paper, the exchange seemed almost perfect: money flowing upward toward the old world, names flowing downward toward the new. But behind that cold logic, there was something that did not appear in the contracts: the concrete lives of those who would sustain that pact with their bodies, their time, their freedom. Because those dollar princesses were not abstract concepts, they were specific people with fears, desires, and very real limits. Here is where the great question that will accompany us throughout this journey is born. Did these heiresses really save the royal and aristocratic families of Europe? Or did they merely buy a seat on a ship that had already been taking on water for decades? Were they saviors, or customers of a system that was using their money to prolong a way of life that was never going to last forever? To answer that, we are not going to stay with generalities. We are going to follow the trail of some specific women. One of them will be our main thread, Consuelo Vanderbilt, perhaps the most famous example of an American heiress given almost literally to an English title. Her story will allow us to see up close what it was like from the inside to live through a marriage that, in the newspapers, looked like a fairy tale, but that in private resembled more an imposed contract. Before her, another woman had opened the path for these transatlantic unions, Jenny Jerome, an American who married a British aristocrat and ended up being the mother of one of the most influential politicians of the 20th century. Through her, we will see the first phase of this phenomenon, when it still seemed a romantic eccentricity and not a repeated pattern. And she will not be alone. We could follow many others. But in this documentary, we will stay with a few strong figures so we do not get lost in a sea of names. Among them, a woman like Mary Leader or Nancy Astor, Americans who not only crossed the ocean to marry into titles, but also ended up having their own voice in the political and social life of their new countries. Not all of them were passive pieces. Some learned to move within the rules of the game and even to bend them. What you are about to hear is not just a story of haute couture dresses, banquets, and spectacular palaces. It is a story of money in amounts that are hard to imagine, of discreet negotiations between families, of letters in which the fate of a person is decided hundreds of miles away. It is also a political story, because saving a noble house did not only mean saving a building, but helping a particular social elite continue to occupy its place in the hierarchy. And, as an inevitable backdrop, the great shocks of the 20th century loom. Wars, revolutions, regime changes that will put to the test the solidity of all those agreements. Over the next 2 hours, we will move between ballrooms and lawyers' offices, between official portraits and intimate diaries. We will see how the myth of the American woman who marries a noble is constructed, and what was left when the ballroom lights went out. Some of these stories end in tragedy, others in liberation, many in a complicated mixture of both. But before we enter those marriages, before we board the ship with Consuelo or Jenny on their way to Europe, we need to understand the origin of it all. Where that money crossing the Atlantic came from, what kind of world had generated it, and what it actually meant to be rich in a time when the word millionaire was starting to acquire a new meaning. To understand why these young American women became a kind of currency, we first have to see where all that money came from, and what it meant to be rich in the United States of the Gilded Age. At the end of the 19th century, the United States had become a gigantic money-making machine. What for Europe had been centuries of slow accumulation was happening for Americans in the span of a few decades. Historians call it the Gilded Age. On the outside, shine, luxury, excess. On the inside, tensions, inequalities, and a constant sense of building on unstable ground. The foundation of it all was industrialization. Where there had once been small port towns, there were now factories that never stopped, railroad lines stitching the country from coast to coast, steel raising bridges and skyscrapers, oil feeding new machines, and an increasingly sophisticated financial system that turned stocks and bonds into almost infinite sources of wealth for a few. Names began to appear that we now recognize almost like brands: Vanderbilt, Astor, Gould, Rockefeller, Carnegie, families that, 1 or 2 generations earlier, had not existed in the circles of the traditional elite. Men who had been modest merchants, farmers' sons, railroad employees, and who, thanks to risk, luck, talent, and also aggressive maneuvers, became kings of entire sectors: railroads, oil, steel. In a very short time, those fortunes changed the physical landscape of the country. Mansions rose on New York's Fifth Avenue with more rooms than a family could use in an entire lifetime. In Newport, Rhode Island, facing the sea, summer houses appeared that inside looked like French or Italian palaces, imported stone by stone in the form of inspiration and design. Every drawing room, every staircase, every fireplace was designed to send a message. We have arrived and we do not intend to leave. But money alone did not buy everything those families desired. On the East Coast, there was already a well-established society. Old families, old by American standards, who thought of themselves as the true high society. They had less money in many cases, but they had something they valued more: respectability, name, time. They had spent decades inviting each other to the same balls, occupying the same private clubs, sending their children to the same universities. When the newly rich began knocking on the door of that world, the response was not enthusiastic. New York private clubs refused to accept certain railroad magnates as members, considering them vulgar, too ostentatious, lacking in good taste. On the guest lists for certain balls, the names of newly enriched families were conspicuously absent. The famous list of the 400, the supposed 400 people who really mattered in New York society, worked like an invisible border. Being inside meant recognition. Being outside, no matter how rich you were, meant still being new. In that clash between old forms and new fortunes, the daughters became key pieces. They were not only cherished, carefully educated, surrounded by dolls, governesses, and dresses. They were also, although no one said it aloud, instruments of social ascent. Every decision about their education, their manners, their circle of friends was steeped in a single intention: to turn them into women capable of entering, with elegance, any drawing room in the world. The girls in these families grew up learning French and sometimes German, playing the piano and the harp, memorizing rules of etiquette that did not even exist formally but felt like laws. They were taught how to walk, how to sit, how to smile, how to converse without seeming either too shy or too bold. Their mothers, who in many cases had known the insecurity of not being accepted by the traditional elites, projected onto them a very concrete dream. You will go where I was not allowed to go. In parallel, the press began to take an interest in these young women. Society columns described their dresses, their appearances at operas and balls, their trips to Europe. The wealthy American heiress became a public figure, someone who fascinated and, at the same time, aroused suspicion. For many, they represented the best of the country: youth, energy, success. For others, they were the symbol of a system where money seemed to have replaced any other standard. The logic, however, was clear. If East Coast clubs and certain New York families imposed limits, where could the missing recognition be bought? The answer began to point toward the other side of the Atlantic. Europe, with its ancient palaces and historical family names, became a kind of showcase of prestige. And if the European system of titles was financially suffocated and the American system of new fortunes was eager to acquire legitimacy, the next step almost wrote itself. The daughters then ceased to be only the key to entering good society in New York. They began to be seen by some families as the key to something even greater: the European nobility. With the right dowry, the right introduction, the right connections, a girl born in a Fifth Avenue mansion could become a duchess, a princess, even in some cases, a key figure in a royal house. Of course, all this was wrapped in romantic language. Magazines spoke of love between continents, of lightning strikes at international balls, of young women discovering Europe as if it were a fairy tale set. But under the surface, the agreements were very concrete. This much money in exchange for this much title, this much prestige in exchange for this much renunciation. Because, let us not forget, for one of these heiresses to marry a European nobleman did not mean adding something without losing anything. It meant leaving behind a country, an environment, a degree of freedom, and accepting a role defined by traditions that were sometimes completely foreign to her. Among all those girls educated in French, piano, and protocol, in the midst of that mixture of luxury and pressure, there was one who literally grew up in a gilded cage, dreaming of being free. Her life would be marked by the iron will of her mother, by an obsession with entering the European elite, and by a marriage that, in the eyes of the world, would embody the perfect pact between American money and English titles. That girl's name was Consuelo Vanderbilt. Before becoming a duchess, she was a teenager looking out the windows of a New York mansion, imagining another possible life, a life she would never be allowed to fully choose for herself. But before we come to her, before we board the ship with her bound for Europe, we need to understand another fundamental piece of this story: how, almost from scratch, the marriage market between Europe and the United States was invented, who organized it, who negotiated it, and what was really placed on the table when an American family and a European aristocratic house decided to join their names. At the end of the 19th century, while American fortunes were consolidating and old European palaces were still searching for ways to stay afloat, a new, almost experimental space began to emerge where the two shores of the Atlantic met. A marriage market as elegant on the outside as it was cold on the inside. And although no one called it that in public, everyone involved knew perfectly well what it was about. The cities that served as great showcases were always the same: London and Paris. not only because they were cultural capitals, but because their social seasons were perfectly designed to display, measure, and compare eligible young women from all over the world. Balls, receptions, court presentations, operas, formal dinners. Every event was an opportunity to observe, evaluate, and above all, talk to the right people. In that game, the mothers of American heiresses became true strategists. They were women who, in many cases, had been rejected or treated condescendingly by old New York society. Women who had learned that money opened doors, but not all of them. So they launched themselves at Europe with determination, studying genealogies, memorizing orders of precedence, deciding which duke was in decline, which count was in debt, and which prince urgently needed an injection of liquidity to maintain his estate. Families organized entire seasons in London or Paris. They rented mansions, bought dresses from the best ateliers, hired governesses to polish the young women's French or German, and sent letters to acquaintances, ambassadors, and diplomatic attachés asking for invitations to this or that event. Sometimes they even resorted to professional intermediaries, discreet figures, part social agent, part matchmaker, who knew the needs of each European house and could suggest possible unions. On the other side of the ocean, the situation was very different, but just as clear. Many European aristocrats were under enormous financial pressure. They owned castles that cost more every year, lands that no longer produced enough, servants to maintain, traditions to uphold, and in some cases, gambling debts or mismanagement that threatened to destroy everything. Socially, they were still respected. Economically, many stood at the edge of the abyss. What had once been sustained by agrarian rents now required cash, and that is where some of them turned their gaze toward America. The logic of the exchange was so obvious that it hardly needed to be spoken aloud. On one side, an American family offered a dowry that could reach unthinkable figures, hundreds of thousands of dollars, equivalent today to tens of millions. On the other, a European family offered something that, on that continent, could not be manufactured or bought: a title, a surname that opened doors at any court, and a position in a social hierarchy that had been operating for centuries. It was an agreement perfectly understood by all the adults involved, though always wrapped in diplomatic language. In the newspapers, they spoke of transatlantic alliances. In high society, they whispered that such and such duke had found a charming wife. In private, the negotiations included clauses such as initial money transfers, annual allowances, rights over properties, future inheritances, and family guarantees. It was a pact. A brilliant, elegant pact, but a pact nonetheless. Amid so much calculation, there was one element that never appeared in the contracts: the people who would live inside that agreement, the young women who crossed the ocean, who left behind their country, their friends, their customs, to enter worlds where nothing entirely belonged to them. On paper, everything was clear: money for a name. What no one included, nor could include, was the emotional price those agreements would impose. And if there was one figure who embodied that tension between public glitter and private sacrifice, it was her. A young woman born into the dazzling luxury of the Gilded Age, but raised under such intense pressure that it turned her life into a mixture of privilege and confinement. Her name was already echoing even before she set foot in London. While other marriages were negotiated in a haze of rumors, hers would be lived as an international spectacle. And that story did not begin in a European palace, but in a mansion much closer to New York, where a mother was weaving a destiny her daughter would never have chosen for herself, even if the whole world believed it to be a perfect fairy tale. To understand the true human cost of transatlantic marriages, we have to pause over a figure who, more than any other, lived the contradiction between luxury and lack of freedom: Consuelo Vanderbilt. Her name, her inheritance, and her fate would make her the perfect symbol of what it meant to be a dollar princess. But before becoming a duchess, before even setting foot in a European drawing room, Consuelo was a child raised under pressure so intense that it shaped her entire adult life. Consuelo was born into one of the most dazzling fortunes in the United States. The Vanderbilts had built their empire on railroads, miles of track, stations, bridges, contracts, investments that seemed to multiply effortlessly. By the end of the 19th century, they were one of the richest families on the planet. Their name appeared in every newspaper, their mansions were objects of fascination, and every social gesture they made set a trend in New York. But in that family, the figure who had the greatest impact on Consuelo's destiny was not her father, but her mother, Alva Vanderbilt, a woman who had known the rejection of old New York elites and who had decided, with implacable determination, that her daughter would never live the same thing. Ambitious, charismatic, fierce when necessary, Alva refused to accept a place on the second rung of high society. She knew that money was not enough. She knew that, to enter certain drawing rooms, she had to prove power, elegance, and a lineage she did not have. Since she could not invent one, she decided to construct it. And for that, she needed her daughter to be perfect. From a very early age, Consuelo was subjected to an education that seemed taken from an 18th century European manual. Foreign languages, so as not to fall behind in any conversation. Music lessons, so she would never be out of place at the piano at a party. Posture lessons, to show no weakness in any drawing room. International protocol, to know exactly how to behave before aristocrats she had never seen. Every movement, every word, every gesture was designed so that one day she could enter any European court without difficulty. But that perfection had a price. While other girls played in gardens or invented stories in toy-filled rooms, Consuelo lived under constant supervision. Her mother corrected every detail, the way she walked, the way she greeted, even the tilt of her head when listening to an adult. There were days when not a single misplaced smile was permitted. And when Consuelo made a mistake, no matter how small, humiliation soon followed. Not physical punishment, but something subtler and deeper. Silent disappointment, the look that said, "With this, you will never get into high society." Consuelo's schedule was not her own. Her days were filled with lessons, engagements, visits, dinners where she was expected to behave like a small adult. Her dresses were chosen for her, as were her public appearances. And beneath all that perfectionism lurked an even harsher idea. Her life was not hers, her life was a project. And, like any child who grows up surrounded by limits, Consuelo began to dream, to imagine another existence, to write letters in which she hinted at her desire for freedom, to fall in love, perhaps for the first time, with young men who did not belong to the world her mother had chosen for her. Sincere friendships that lived outside those gilded drawing rooms, conversations that slipped away from Alva's meticulous plans, small acts of rebellion that never went very far, because maternal control always reasserted itself. The cage on the inside was made of gold, but it was still a cage. Consuelo would eventually discover that her future was being negotiated in drawing rooms where she had no voice. Around her, without her being able to do anything, people spoke of potential husbands, of European titles, of dowries that might save ancient castles. And while her name circulated as a key piece in those silent agreements, she remained a teenager who only wanted to breathe without feeling the weight of an impossible expectation. While Consuelo was living that childhood between luxury and confinement, somewhere else on the map, a compatriot of hers had already crossed the ocean and become the first great bridge between the United States and the British aristocracy. Her story, full of brilliance and contradictions, would open a path that Consuelo was destined to follow, whether she wanted to or not. Long before the name Consuelo Vanderbilt appeared in European headlines, there was already a young American woman who had crossed the Atlantic to join a historic British family name. Her story not only opened a path that others would follow, it also showed, for the first time, how a union between money and tradition could be born without seeming like an obvious transaction. That young woman was Jenny Jerome. Jenny came from a wealthy New York family, although not one as colossal as the Vanderbilts. Her father, Leonard Jerome, had made his fortune in investments and finance, and his social life was intense, full of dinners, trips, and ambitions. Jenny inherited from him a rare combination for the time: spectacular beauty, sharp intelligence, and a natural ability to move in any environment, whether a European drawing room or a North American cultural scene. She did not take long to attract attention when, together with her mother, she traveled to Europe for a social season. In England, the encounter that would mark her destiny unfolded almost like a scene from a novel. Jenny met Lord Randolph Churchill, a member of an aristocratic family with deep roots in British politics. He was not a prince, nor a duke, nor the heir to an economic empire, but his surname carried enormous weight in the United Kingdom. For Jenny, it represented something new and fascinating. For Lord Randolph, Jenny was an irresistible combination of charm, energy, and a touch of North American exoticism that was rare in British society. The marriage was celebrated with enormous media attention. It was the union of two worlds that had, until then, regarded each other with curiosity, but from a distance. On one side, the British aristocracy, owners of land, titles, and traditions. On the other, American wealth, young, dynamic, with a hint of boldness. From that union arose a figure who would shape the course of 20th century history. Winston Churchill, son of a British lord and an American woman with an indomitable spirit. Jenny was not a decorative wife or a submissive figure. She knew how to navigate the English court with a skill that surprised many. Her presence was magnetic, elegant at balls, brilliant in conversation, modern in a society that still moved with the rigidity of the Victorian era. It was impossible to ignore her, and her influence was felt both in her husband's political rise and later in her son's development. She was a genuine pioneer, a woman who disproved the stereotypes about newly arrived American women in Europe. Her case, however, was not an isolated phenomenon. Even before the marriage market across the Atlantic became an organized structure, other American women had found paths into Europe. Some married French nobles, others minor Italian princes or members of German houses in decline. These first marriages created a new fascination in the Old World. American women were seen as energetic, educated, less constrained by tradition, and in more than a few cases, surprisingly free in their lifestyle. They were refreshing figures in courts where so many things seemed frozen in place for centuries. But there was another side as well, the economic one. Although the earliest marriages, like Jenny's, could have romantic overtones, many European houses soon began to see American heiresses as financial opportunities. Their dowries were large, sometimes indispensable to sustain a struggling estate, and although no one said it openly in public, the agreements included concrete figures. What had begun as mutual fascination gradually became a system in which each side knew exactly what the other needed. Jenny, in a sense, was lucky. Her marriage allowed her to shine, to influence, even to reinvent herself. She endured difficult moments, of course, marital crises, tensions with her in-laws, constant rumors, but also experiences that gave her a degree of freedom that many of those who came after her would never know. She moved confidently between Europe and America, maintained deep friendships, and partly escaped the mold that other heiresses were forced to accept. Because the model Jenny helped establish, a rich American woman joined to a European nobleman, would eventually evolve into something much more rigid. When the initial sparkle gave way to economic necessity, when European titles began to depend almost desperately on American dowries, the tone changed. What once seemed a voluntary exchange began to take the shape of an obligation. In many cases, romance disappeared entirely from the equation. And so, inevitably, we returned to Consuelo Vanderbilt. She was not going to live a story like Jenny's. She would have no room to choose or to fall freely in love or to negotiate her own destiny. The combination of an ambitious mother and a European aristocracy hungry for liquidity would turn her marriage into something far removed from a genuine choice. In her case, the ocean would not merely separate two worlds. It would be the wall that kept her away from the life she desired. When the name Consuelo Vanderbilt began to circulate insistently in European drawing rooms, it was not because of what she had done, but because of what she was worth, not as a person, but as a figure. In discreet conversations between ambassadors, society ladies, and indebted aristocrats, her identity was reduced to a very simple combination: young, stunning, and heiress to a fortune that could save an entire noble house. On the other side of the Atlantic, in England, there was a title that sounded like the glory of the past: the Duke of Marlborough. The Churchill-Marlborough family was no ordinary one. Its ancestors were linked to military victories, politics, and Blenheim Palace, one of the most impressive palaces in Europe. The stone, the gardens, the history, everything suggested greatness. But walls are not held up by memories, but by money. And that was precisely what was lacking. Blenheim Palace was beautiful and incredibly expensive to maintain. The lands no longer yielded as before, expenses mounted, and the lifestyle that the aristocracy considered normal clashed more and more with actual income. In that context, the Duke needed something his ancestors would never have imagined, a financial rescue. And that rescue bore an American surname. The negotiations between the Vanderbilt family and the Duke were not a fairy tale. They were essentially a contract. Dowry figures were discussed, as well as conditions and social expectations. They spoke of hundreds of thousands of dollars of the time, amounts capable of restoring, refurbishing, paying off debts, and guaranteeing that Blenheim would continue to be the symbol of a greatness no longer backed by time or the economy. On that chessboard, Alva Vanderbilt moved like a consummate strategist. For her, marrying her daughter to a British duke was not just a family achievement, it was the final consecration of her own struggle to be accepted in the social elite, first in the United States and then in Europe. She had invested years, parties, calculated scandals, colossal architectural works, all so that the most exclusive society could not ignore her. A duke as a son-in-law was the last piece of the puzzle. Consuelo, meanwhile, was living a very different story. On a personal level, she was in love with another man, someone with whom she imagined a simpler life, and above all, a chosen one. She was not a rebel without a cause nor a romantic figure from a cheap novel. She was a young woman educated to obey, but lucid enough to understand that the marriage being imposed on her had nothing to do with her happiness. She tried to resist. She showed her refusal. She expressed her desire to follow another path. That was where the Gilded Cage closed completely. Alva, who had built her identity around the idea of never accepting a no from society, did not accept a no from her own daughter either. The emotional and psychological pressure was intense. According to the accounts that have reached us, we are not speaking merely of insistent advice, but of emotional blackmail, tears, veiled threats, dramatic scenes that made it clear to Consuelo that her duty was not to be happy, but to serve the family project. In the end, the young woman gave in. Not because she changed her mind, but because she was facing a force that in her world was almost impossible to defy. The will of a mother who saw in her marriage the crowning of an entire life of ambition. The wedding was celebrated with great pomp. For New York, and for much of the international press, it was a dazzling event, a dollar princess joining an English dukedom. For Alva, it was an absolute triumph. For the Duke, a successful deal. For European aristocracy, a perfect example of what the Atlantic could provide. For Consuelo, by contrast, it was an intimate defeat. On her wedding day, images show her radiant, impeccable, wrapped in silk, jewels, and flowers. But behind all those elements, there was a different reality. She was entering a marriage she had never wanted. The bells that rang were celebrating, at the same time, the rescue of Blenheim and the sacrifice of her own desire. When Consuelo arrived in England and settled at Blenheim Palace, the impact was twofold. On one hand, the majesty of the place, endless rooms, portraits of ancestors, gardens designed to impress. Everything seemed to say to her, "You are at the center of history." On the other hand, the coldness of the environment. New social codes, a social circle that regarded her with curiosity and, in some cases, with a certain veiled contempt, different customs, clear expectations of how she should behave, speak, dress, and above all, obey. The Duke also had his own expectations. He was not only seeking the money he had already received, he expected a wife who would reinforce his status, give him heirs, and accept without too much complaint the place assigned to her in the British social order. Their relationship was marked from the very beginning by distance. There was little room for spontaneous affection. Almost everything was permeated by calculation, pressure, and etiquette. Suddenly, Consuelo found herself turned into a symbolic figure. For some, she was the proof of American triumph, a girl from New York reigning in an English palace. For others, an interloper with too much money and too little tradition. But beyond those interpretations, the essential truth is simpler and harsher. She was a young woman who had been used as a financial solution. During those first years, her life oscillated between the most extreme luxury and a deep sense of emptiness. She fulfilled her duties, attended functions, organized engagements, appeared where she was supposed to appear. But the sense of having been torn away from the life she desired did not fade. Neither the marble, nor the titles, nor the dresses could compensate for that renunciation. The paradox was brutal. Consuelo had saved Blenheim with her fortune, but no one worried about saving her from a life written by others. And the most significant thing is that her story was not unique. While she tried to adapt to her new reality, other American women kept crossing the ocean with similar destinies. Each new marriage was celebrated as a social event, as a brilliant exchange between old world and new. Yet behind the society columns, a question began to take shape, almost in silence. To what extent were these heiresses truly sustaining European aristocracy? And to what extent were they merely buying time for a system that no longer fit the world that was coming? The money that crossed the Atlantic was not just figures on paper. It was, literally, the oxygen that kept many European noble houses open. And at the same time, it was a kind of poisoned oxygen. The more they breathed it in, the more dependent on it they became. At the end of the 19th century, the dowry of an American heiress could easily reach the hundreds of thousands of dollars of the time. Translated into today's terms, we would be talking about several millions. It was not a matter of helping out the in-laws with some savings. It was injecting into a single wedding the equivalent of decades of agricultural rents or rental income. For many dukes, counts, and princes in trouble, that check was the difference between keeping the palace or seeing the appraiser and the banker walk in. In the case of Consuelo Vanderbilt, her dowry was used for what many dollar princesses' dowries were expected to do: plug holes. Gambling debts, old mortgages, overdue representation expenses, money borrowed from bankers who could no longer be fobbed off with excuses. The first priority was not to build anything new, but to avoid the scandal of foreclosure, public auction, social ridicule. American money, above all, bought time. A significant part of those fortunes went to what we might call cosmetic surgery of the estate. Restoring collapsing ceilings, redecorating drawing rooms with new furniture, repairing leaky roofs, giving the gardens a minimum appearance of dignity so they could continue to receive guests. From the outside, the castle or palace regained its shine. From the inside, the numbers remained uncomfortable. The land was worth less, peasants were migrating to the cities, taxes were rising, wages could no longer be paid as before. In the best cases, a dowry allowed for more than just window dressing. Some aristocrats tried to modernize their estates, invest in agricultural machinery, diversify crops, develop forestry or mining operations, participate in industrial enterprises. The logic was clear. Use the heiress's money to transform a feudal structure into something closer to a modern business. If it worked, the noble house could hope to survive without needing yet another rich princess in the next generation. But it did not always work. For every aristocrat who thought like an entrepreneur, there was another who continued to live as if the 18th century had never ended. Endless dinners, lavish hunts, seasons in town, travel, clothes, jewels, horses, new motor cars. The dowry money, which on paper seemed inexhaustible, could evaporate in a decade of high-flying life. And when it was gone, the underlying problem remained. Unprofitable land, outdated structures, a world changing far too fast. There is something almost tragic in this operation. On paper, European aristocrats were doing the logical thing, seeking liquidity without selling their soul, that is, without relinquishing land or title. In practice, they were mortgaging the future of the house on a single move: a well-made marriage. If it turned out badly economically, they were left without money and with a dented reputation. If it turned out badly emotionally, they were left with a broken family. But the bills paid, and many times both things happened at once. In the case of Blenheim, the palace associated with the dukedom of Marlborough, Consuelo's dowry made it possible to save a symbol. The building remained standing, the drawing rooms continued to receive guests, the surname did not disappear from high society lists. From the point of view of art history and architectural heritage, one might say it was a success. Without that money, it is possible that Blenheim would have followed the fate of many residences: sale, partial demolition, abandonment. From the human point of view, the price was infinitely harder to justify. And that contrast repeats itself over and over. We see palaces that survive thanks to checks signed far away in New York or Chicago. We see payment orders containing astronomical sums attached to young women who pose in extraordinarily expensive wedding dresses with a practiced smile. What we do not always see are those families' balance sheets 20 years later. Some accounts add up, others do not. In some cases, even today, it is not entirely clear where every dollar went. That is where the small mystery of these stories appears. Not only were letters and contracts lost, money trails were lost as well. Dowries that leave the United States with a clear destination and that, in Europe, disperse among bankers, creditors, failed projects, everyday expenses. There are genuine financial black holes, fortunes that dissolve without leaving more trace than a vague entry in a ledger, a comment in a diary, or a renovation for which no one keeps exact accounts. If we look at the whole picture, the answer to the big question, did these heiresses really save the European houses, is uncomfortable. In the short term, yes, they prevented scandalous bankruptcies, sustained emblematic palaces, financed political campaigns, allowed historic surnames to continue occupying seats in upper chambers and positions at court. In the long term, what American money bought was not so much salvation as a reprieve. The economic model of many of those houses remained anchored in a world that was ending, a world of land rents, automatic deference to titles, politics conducted in drawing rooms. While the heiresses were signing checks, the world around those palaces was changing. Industrialists without titles were amassing real power, political parties were questioning privileges, labor and suffrage movements were forcing reforms, and the wars on the horizon would blow apart not only finances, but the very idea of hereditary aristocracy. Amid all that historical noise, the human dimension did not disappear. Every figure in a marriage contract came with a face, a trembling signature, a sea voyage toward an unknown life. The exchange, dollars for titles, worked in bank accounts, but it opened wounds in drawing rooms and bedrooms. Because over time, many of these women discovered that they had helped keep standing a building that, inside, was full of cracks. At official dinners, their husbands might toast the salvation of the house. In private, these women found themselves caught between two worlds, too American to fit fully into old Europe, too European after years of protocol to simply go back home. And that cultural, emotional, everyday clash is what would begin to strain many of these marriages. Because paying the palace's bills is only the first part. The second, far more complex, is learning to live inside it. And that is where money ceases to be the central issue and the focus shifts to glances, silences, words that cannot be spoken, and the decisions some of these heiresses would make to try to recover, even if late, a part of the life that had been taken from them. On paper, the exchange seemed simple. They provided the money, they provided the title, and everyone carried on with their lives in palaces and grand country houses. But that contract had fine print that did not appear in any dowry agreement: the clash of worlds. American heiresses arrived in Europe with exquisite educations, yes, but also with something that sounded almost scandalous in many courts: naturalness. They came from a country where millionaires still remembered grandparents who had been shopkeepers, farmers, or immigrants, where the dinner table could host more frank conversation, and where recent money made up for the lack of a family name. In drawing rooms where every gesture had been codified for centuries, that was almost a provocation. Imagine a dinner in an English aristocratic house at the end of the 19th century. The American woman, seated halfway down the table, tries straightforward conversation with the guest across from her, asks him about his work, makes a remark about politics, laughs perhaps a bit louder than expected. The others follow the usual script: safe topics, courteous phrases, strategic silences. To her, that is simply being friendly. To some of them, it is a lack of restraint. Consuelo Vanderbilt experienced this firsthand on arriving at Blenheim. She had been trained to greet correctly, to incline her head at just the right angle, to dress according to protocol. But there was something that could not be rehearsed, the feeling that, whatever she did, there would always be someone watching, measuring, classifying every word with a mental note of, "That is not how we do it here." Her mother had prepared her to shine. The court, by contrast, seemed determined to remind her constantly that she was a guest, not the author of the play. Jenny Jerome, in the previous generation, also collided with those unwritten rules. Her charm, quick speech, and independence of spirit sparked fascination and suspicion, the very traits that some found modern and seductive, others interpreted as signs of American frivolity. The line was razor thin, and many spent their lives walking along it. Dress became a field of silent battle. American women arrived with gowns inspired by Paris fashions, with necklines, shimmer, and boldness that in Newport were seen as being up to date. In certain European courts, that could immediately become a subject of gossip. Too showy, too new money, too little respect for the sobriety of tradition. A slightly unconventional tiara, a necklace deemed too ostentatious, a color inappropriate for the occasion, were enough to generate a juicy column of chatter in the press. Because the press, of course, smelled the opportunity. The American duchesses, the dollar princesses, became recurring figures in caricatures, society columns, and satires. They were portrayed as invaders with purses full of cash, as bargain-hunting buyers of surnames on sale. Their etiquette blunders, real or invented, were exaggerated for the delight of readers who saw in them both a spectacle and a symptom of changing times. Every misplaced smile, every misinterpreted remark could end up distilled into a cruel sentence in the morning paper. Inside the houses, the most painful battleground was often the in-laws. Many of these women found themselves face to face with mothers-in-law who saw them as a necessary evil, the source of money securing the family's future, but also the living proof that the house had had to stoop to doing business with the new world. Comparisons with past suitable fiancés, venomous comments about American habits, small humiliations in the running of the household, all this formed part of a domestic Cold War that never appeared in the official portraits. Ladies-in-waiting and courtiers did not always help either. Some adapted, others dug in behind, "This is how it has always been done." A phrase spoken loudly enough for her to hear, a whisper cut short as soon as she entered the room, a piece of protocol advice that sounded more like reproach than help. Small gestures, but repeated day after day, erode any romantic illusion that might remain. There were, of course, open scandals. Marriages in which infidelities were an open secret, lovers accepted de facto, husbands who fulfilled the public part of the bargain, appearing arm in arm at official functions, but reserved their private lives for other arms. Some American women ended up copying that pattern. If the emotional contract was broken, they could at least negotiate their own margin of freedom in exchange for discretion. Others found themselves trapped in the effort to maintain a perfect facade while crumbling inside. The press fed on all this. Rumors of undeclared separations, oddly timed seasons in remote spas, conspicuous absences from key events. Everything invited the interpretation that something was going wrong in these marriages that, on paper, were ideal alliances. But what in the newspapers was a game of clues. In the protagonists' lives could mean loneliness, shame, and the anguish of knowing that any decision, staying, leaving, keeping silent, speaking out, would have public repercussions. Many lived with the feeling of not fully belonging anywhere. In the United States, their surnames had become stories no longer their own. They were the ones who married a duke, the one who lives in such and such castle, almost fictional characters. In Europe, they were never anything but the Americans, too direct for the unwritten rules of old aristocracy, too conscious of their origins to pretend they had always belonged to that world. And yet, amid that constant tension, some began to find unexpected spaces of maneuver. A side conversation at a dinner, a letter sent to the right person, a charitable cause carefully chosen, a visit organized to a poor neighborhood, a word of support at a delicate political moment. If they were condemned to live between two worlds, there was one possibility. Use that uncomfortable position as a leverage point. Because that sense of strangeness, that different way of seeing the court, neither totally dazzled nor totally resigned, gave them something few around them had: perspective. What for others was unquestionable tradition, for them could be a system that could be touched, nudged, softened, or challenged, even if only on a small scale. From there, the story of American heiresses in Europe ceases to be only that of women out of place in alien palaces and begins to become something else as well, that of people who, despite their gilded cages, found ways to influence real decisions, shape social causes, and open doors to changes that neither their husbands nor their mothers-in-law would have imagined. And that part of the story, the least told, is the one that begins to unfold when we stop looking only at dresses and scandals, and pay attention to what was happening in offices, in letters, and in drawing rooms where people spoke in low voices. For years, the typical image of American heiresses in Europe has been that of trapped women, plenty of money, little voice. But not all of them accepted that role. Some, once installed in palaces and official residences, decided to do more than pose in photographs and fulfill protocol. Among them, two names stand out for their very different paths: Mary Leader and Nancy Astor. Mary Leader was born in Chicago, daughter of a retail magnate, and was raised in luxuries similar to those of other young women of the Gilded Age. But her path would take her much further. She ended up marrying George Curzon, a brilliant, ambitious British aristocrat deeply convinced of the civilizing role of the empire. When he was appointed Viceroy of India, she became Lady Curzon, a central figure in the imperial British display of power in the Raj. Imagine the scene: Delhi in the early 20th century. Lavish receptions, endless banquets, ceremonies carefully designed to impress both local princes and foreign observers. In that theater of power, Mary was no mere extra. Her presence, her way of dressing, the events she sponsored, all projected an image of elegance and modernity that formed part of the political message. The British Empire was powerful, yes, but also refined, glamorous, sophisticated. Mary involved herself in social projects, hospitals, public health initiatives for women, visits to local institutions. From the perspective of her time, she saw herself as someone who helped, who improved other people's lives. From today's perspective, it is impossible not to see the shadows. Her work was embedded in a profoundly unequal colonial structure that she herself never truly questioned at its roots. There lies the complexity of her figure. She was at once a woman expanding the bounds of the traditional female role, and an obedient piece in an imperial mechanism. Curzon said that Mary was one of his greatest political assets, not only because she reinforced his image in society, but because she knew how to listen, connect, and sense the mood in drawing rooms. American heiresses had learned from childhood to withstand stares, gossip, and judgments. Some turned that defensive skill into an offensive tool, reading the atmosphere in a room and acting accordingly. Mary was one of them. Nancy Astor's case takes this evolution a step further. Born in Virginia, in a family that, like so many others, had gone from hardship to wealth in a few decades, Nancy arrived in England after a first failed marriage in the United States. There, she married Waldorf Astor, heir to a colossal fortune and to a solid political position. What no one imagined at first was that it would be she, and not he, who ended up marking a turning point in British politics. When Waldorf moved up to the House of Lords and left his seat in the House of Commons vacant, Nancy decided to run in the election. What many saw as almost an extravagance, a woman, and an American at that, asking for the votes of a British constituency, became an unexpected symbol. In 1919, Nancy Astor became the first woman to take her seat in the House of Commons. Her presence in Westminster was anything but decorative. Her speeches on alcoholism, family, morality, religion, and social issues elicited as much admiration as rejection. She did not fit the image some had of the grateful great lady. She was incisive, sometimes brusque, confident to the point of being uncomfortable for many male colleagues. She also carried prejudices and ideological positions that today we would find debatable or outright unacceptable, making her a difficult figure to fit neatly into hero or villain. What is interesting in this context is that her path demonstrates something that would have seemed unthinkable only a few decades earlier. An American heiress who, in another era, would merely have been marriage material for a European title, managed to turn that title and that social position into a political platform of her own. Family money had been her entry passport. What she did once inside was her own decision. Mary Leader in India, Nancy Astor in the British Parliament, and alongside them, other American women who, without achieving such visibility, also found spaces of influence. Some dedicated themselves to cultural patronage, funding theaters, orchestras, art schools. Others called charity, what in practice were local development projects, soup kitchens, nurseries, training centers. Many embraced causes that today seem ambiguous: moral crusades, temperance leagues, initiatives tied to a highly paternalistic vision of social order. It is easy to judge from the present, but seen in their own time, these women were stretching the limits of what was considered acceptable for their gender and their class. Where previously a nobleman's wife was expected merely to preside over harmless charity balls, now some dared to speak about politics, to take sides in public debates, to use the surname they had acquired as a key to enter decision-making spaces traditionally reserved for men. They also carried with them, consciously or not, certain American ways of relating. A greater willingness to speak in the first person, to show openness with the press, to use humor or straightforwardness in contexts where European aristocracy clung to its stiffest formulas. They were not radical revolutionaries, but many acted as small cracks in a very old wall. One scene appears again and again if you review memoirs, letters, and chronicles from the time, that of the American woman who, after years of painful adaptation, begins to command both the language of the court and that of civil society, and discovers that this dual mastery gives her unexpected power. She can speak to politicians and journalists, to noble ladies and wealthy merchants, to military figures and religious leaders. She becomes a bridge, and there, amid all the hands resting on her, she finds some room to maneuver. That does not mean they stopped paying a price. Many remained trapped in unhappy marriages, in webs of conflicting loyalties, in impossible expectations of how a great lady should behave. But they were no longer merely pieces on someone else's board. In some cases, they took the board in both hands and moved it, even if only a few inches. Meanwhile, the world around them was changing at a speed that neither old surnames nor new millions could fully control. Labor movements, suffrage campaigns, colonial tensions, nationalisms, everything mixed together in a Europe that believed itself secure behind its palaces and boulevards, but was in fact marching toward one of the greatest ruptures in its history. In those years of accelerated change, families that had united American fortunes and European titles began to face an awkward question. To what extent were they part of the old order? And to what extent did they need to adapt to the new one? The heiresses who had learned to move between worlds seemed better prepared for that ambivalence, but none of them could imagine what was about to happen when dates, military alliances, and diplomatic crises began to align on the horizon. The drawing rooms where people once discussed social seasons and charity campaigns began to fill with whispers about political maneuvers, ultimatums, and possible conflicts. And those families made up of British, French, or German surnames and fortunes, born in the heat of Wall Street and the railroads, discovered that the coming storm would not distinguish between old aristocracy and new rich. It would sweep them all into the same whirlpool. At the beginning of the 20th century, the great exchange of money for titles seemed to have found a certain balance. American heiresses were no longer exotic rarities, but part of the European social landscape. Families had learned to live with that mixture: capital from New York, protocol from London, French palaces, German castles. What no one suspected was that in very little time, something as seemingly solid as a noble surname could become a risk, almost a target. When the First World War broke out in 1914, that entire network of transatlantic marriages tightened at once. Overnight, surnames began to be classified into sides. Having family in Germany, Austria, or any enemy country stopped being a cosmopolitan curiosity and became a burden. Letters were delayed, censored, lost. Visits that had once been arranged every season were suspended indefinitely. Suddenly, many of these women discovered that the uncles, cousins, or in-laws they had met at balls and on summer holidays were now the other side of the front. In England, France, or Italy, suspicion of anything foreign skyrocketed. Some American women who had been received with curiosity or envy now began to be viewed with mistrust. Not so much because of their origin, from an allied country, but because of the connections they carried with them. German mothers-in-law, Prussian cousins, friendships woven in a Europe that existed before the trenches. There were topics that were no longer discussed in public, family photographs that discreetly disappeared from the walls, surnames it became more prudent not to mention. On the continent, the situation could be even more precarious. Heiresses married into aristocratic houses in Germany or the Austro-Hungarian Empire experienced the conflict from the defeated side. They saw the prestige of their surnames sink along with the monarchies, saw old loyalties collapse when hunger, inflation, and defeat entered the picture. Some found themselves physically trapped. They could not easily return to the United States. Travel was dangerous, visas hard to obtain. They were too American to be seen as completely from here, but too settled to go back to being from there. The fall of great empires after the war, the German, the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, dragged down many of the houses they had allied with. Thrones were abolished, titles remained only on paper, properties were confiscated or broken up. A dowry that 20 years earlier had looked like a bridge to eternal aristocratic status now seemed like an investment made in a building that was collapsing. Some families tried to salvage what they could, sold jewelry, paintings, furniture, negotiated with new governments. Others simply had no room to maneuver. History was moving too fast. The interwar period did not really bring calm, but a sort of permanent hangover. The American fortunes that had supported so many palaces were also hit. The crash of 1929 and the Great Depression struck at the financial base of many of these families. Some assets shrank by half or more in a matter of months. Money that was assumed to be inexhaustible turned out to be as vulnerable as any other to the swings of Wall Street. The heiresses who had once crossed the ocean as rescuing partners glanced sideways at their accounts and wondered how long they could keep up the facade. Meanwhile, political movements radicalized. Across continental Europe, fascism, Nazism, and communism offered narratives that, each in its own way, pointed to traditional elites as part of the problem. In that climate, bearing a grand European surname and having contributed an American dowry was hardly a winning card. Some families tried to adapt, discreetly supporting one side or another in the hope of protecting their positions. Others maintained proud distance, convinced the tide would pass. In almost all cases, the women who had joined those worlds found themselves entangled in decisions they rarely had taken themselves. When the Second World War arrived, the balance was broken again, this time with even greater violence. Palaces and mansions that had served as settings for balls and receptions became military targets, improvised barracks, field hospitals. Some American women lived through the bombings in London, Paris, or other European cities, experiencing little difference from their neighbors. Nights in shelters, boarded-up windows, suitcases kept ready in case of evacuation. In occupied territories, the risk multiplied. Having a well-known surname could mean a measure of protection, or exactly the opposite. In some cases, social prestige allowed negotiation, movement, access to safe conducts. In others, standing out was the last thing one wanted. In areas under Nazi control, ties to enemy families or contacts abroad could arouse very dangerous suspicions. Once again, the networks woven in peacetime turned into maps of risk. The children of these marriages lived an even more fragmented reality. Some served in the British Army, others in the American one, others even in the German Army, depending on where they had grown up, what passport they held, or what family pressure they had experienced. It is possible to find in the same generation cousins who fought on opposing sides without ever having met, linked by a surname that meant little on official documents, but told long and complicated stories in family trees. For those who had grown up listening to stories about seasons in Paris, summers on the Riviera, and winters in London, the new normal was different. Rationing, lists of the missing, fragmentary news. Palaces were no longer the settings of romantic novels, but structures to be repaired, heated, defended against looting or confiscation. The millions that had crossed the Atlantic decades earlier now mattered far less than something more basic: food, safety, a roof that could withstand the coming winter. Amid that storm, it is hardly surprising that many of these women mentally retraced the path that had brought them there. They remembered the promises of stability, security, forever that had accompanied the marriage agreements. Some might have asked themselves, even if they never wrote it down, if everything could collapse so quickly, what exactly had their families bought? A place in history or an expensive ticket to a performance that ended too soon? When at last the final gun fell silent and Europe was left divided into zones of occupation, new borders, and ruined cities, the social map was redrawn once more. Many noble families lost what remained of their estates, especially in territories that came under Soviet control. Some American women returned to their country, taking with them little more than memories and a few personal objects. Others stayed because their lives, for better or worse, were anchored there. From that moment on, the weight of the surname was no longer enough to define the future. Titles lost direct political influence, great estates were broken up or expropriated. The old codes of high society no longer set the rhythm of the world. Those who had survived with or without their fortunes intact faced a very different kind of question from the ones their mothers and grandmothers had known. It was no longer about whom to marry to consolidate a position, but about what to do with the life that remained in a century, speaking of democracy, mass consumption, and social mobility. At that point, the old formula, dollars for titles, revealed itself as something profoundly outdated. The market had changed. Capital was now measured not only in surnames and hectares, but in companies, brands, ideas, professions, and the very women who had once been taken to Europe to prop up a dying system had to decide whether to cling to that world or learn to move in a very different one. When the gunpowder settled and the headlines stopped talking about royal weddings and began talking about reconstruction, many of those heiresses found themselves facing something no one had ever promised them: a second chance. It was not always pretty. It was almost never easy. But it existed. In Consuelo Vanderbilt's case, the fairy tale had already done a lot of damage before it began to be repaired. Years of a cold marriage, useful for the palace finances but devastating for her, had made it clear that the alliance between New York and Blenheim had worked better on paper than in the heart. What is interesting is what comes afterwards. Consuelo does not stay frozen in the role of the poor rich woman sacrificed. As time passes and after many tensions, something arrives that would have been unthinkable for the previous generation: divorce. Not a romantic escape, not a nighttime flight, but a legal process, public, humiliating in some aspects, yet also liberating. The woman who had been displayed as the perfect trophy of the British aristocracy dares to say in practice, no more. And the most important thing is what she does with that freedom. Consuelo does not return to the United States to hide. She rebuilds her life, finds a partner she chooses herself, becomes involved in social projects, supports educational and charitable initiatives. She begins to occupy spaces not as a duchess bought with dollars, but as a person with opinions of her own. Years later, when she writes her memoirs, what she sets down on paper is not just high society gossip, but a sort of reckoning with an entire system. Her story is not unique. Other heiresses, widowed or separated, follow similar paths. Some become great philanthropists, using the money that once served to prop up palaces to found hospitals, scholarships, libraries. Others pour themselves into writing memoirs, diaries, novels in thin disguise that tell, with greater or lesser subtlety, what it meant to live on that frontier between two worlds. Writing becomes, for several of them, a way to regain control of their own narrative. There are also those who transform their drawing rooms into something different, from stages for rigid balls into small cultural centers. They organize concerts, exhibitions, salons where artists, journalists, and politicians begin to mix. It is a subtle change, but it reveals something profound. If a title no longer guarantees political power, it can at least be used as a social magnet to push other things forward. Among the pioneers, we see even more striking paths. Jenny Jerome, for example, was hardly a model of the submissive wife. Her emotional and social life broke rules and scandalized more than one contemporary, but it also allowed her to move in political circles, to influence her son's career, and to show that an American woman in London could be more than a purse on legs. Her legacy is not just having brought dollars into the British aristocracy, but having embodied a kind of woman who negotiated for her own margin of maneuver, even if it came at the cost of stumbles. Nancy Astor, for her part, takes reinvention to another level. From someone's wife, she goes on to occupy a seat in the British Parliament. Her ideas and positions may be more or less appealing when viewed from today, But the simple fact that an American woman who arrived by way of marriage ended up participating in the political life of her adopted country shows how far this movement of second lives could go. As the 20th century advances, the classic dollar princess model begins to blur. It is no longer so simple, nor so necessary, to send daughters to Europe to buy a title. On one hand, the aristocracies have lost a large part of their real power. On the other, possibilities for women in the United States begin to open up: universities, professions, political participation, artistic vocations. Suddenly, marrying a ruined count ceases to be the only way to turn a fortune into prestige. The new generations of heiresses grow up with different role models. They still live in impressive mansions. But now there are women in their environment who are businesswomen, art collectors with their own judgment, leaders of foundations, even media figures with names and surnames who shine on their own. Marriage remains important, but it loses the weight of family strategic project that it had in the time of their mothers and grandmothers. That does not mean everything is magically fixed. Many of those who try to rebuild their lives run into the limits of the era: restrictive divorce laws, moral prejudice, loss of social position. The price of stepping off the script can be high, and not all of them are willing or able to pay it. For every Consuelo who reinvents herself, there are others who remain trapped in cold marriages, in houses increasingly empty of money and of meaning. Even so, something important has changed: the very idea that a life can have several stages. The first dollar princesses were raised for a single, solid, unquestionable destiny. Those who survive wars, crises, and separations discover that it is possible, with great effort, to write a second act. They are no longer just magnates' daughters or dukes' wives. They can be patrons of museums, pacifist activists, founders of schools, sponsors of young artists, even critical voices toward the system that shaped them. Over time, the term dollar princess itself begins to sound old, almost caricatured. The mid-century press prefers to speak of socialites, of film stars, of fashion icons. The collective imagination stops focusing on the American girl who buys a title and turns the camera toward other scenes. Haute couture shows, Hollywood shoots, advertising campaigns. The stage on which prestige is played out has shifted. For today's viewer, used to celebrity divorces, reinvention biographies, and new life stories almost as a genre, it is easy to see these second chances as something natural. But for those women raised from childhood to be someone's wife in a rigid world, every decision to break away, to write, to work, to participate in politics, or simply to say, "I do not want to go on like this," had the taste of a small revolution. Yet, even when the legal papers changed and new projects took shape, there was something much harder to alter: the way they saw themselves. Years of education designed to turn them into useful pieces on a very specific board do not vanish overnight. On the outside, the outfit could be different. On the inside, the stitching was still in the same place. Truly understanding these second lives means not stopping at the bright ending, the liberating divorce, the philanthropic work, the new marriage for love, but asking what all that past does to a person, what it leaves behind, what it weighs, what it conditions. Because even if they change country, husband, house, or even surname, many of them carry for decades the same certainty. From the very beginning, someone designed their existence as part of a plan they did not choose. And that mark, invisible but deep, is what allows us to go a little further than the social and economic story. Behind dowry figures and wedding photographs are women who learned from childhood to behave as symbols, as investments, as answers to other people's ambitions. What comes afterwards, second chances, new paths, does not erase that first inscription. It only rewrites it, layer upon layer. If we really want to understand what it meant to be one of those heiresses who crossed the Atlantic, we have to go precisely there. Inside. Into the education, the phrases repeated over and over, the expectations placed on their shoulders long before anyone mentioned the name of a duke or a European palace. Only then does it become clear that, before they were wives, widows, divorcees, or philanthropists, they were something even harder to undo: carefully carved pieces designed to fit into someone else's board. When we think of these heiresses crossing the Atlantic, It is easy to picture only the external part, the ship, the wedding dress, the triumphant entrance into a grand European palace. It is much harder to see what happens afterwards, when the music stops and everyday life settles in. That is where the real psychological price begins: split identities, life stories that seem binational not only in the passport, but in the mind. For many of them, the shock was not a single dramatic moment, but a slow erosion. They had grown up in the United States with certain codes, more spontaneity, more social mobility, an idea, sometimes naive, that everything can be remade if one tries hard enough. When they arrived in Europe, they discovered a world where none of that mattered as much as the surname, protocol, the age of the furniture, and the correct order of the cutlery. Every day, small reminders that things are done differently here. That cultural difference slowly turns into an internal tension. In their parents' home, they were the promise of the future. In their husband's home, they were often the American, useful, but suspect. Rich enough to pay for restoring the gallery ceiling, but not one of us enough to have a say in certain conversations. The message, more or less explicit, was repeated. You belong, but only up to a point. From that feeling, a very particular kind of loneliness is born. It is not the loneliness of someone physically isolated, but of someone who feels foreign everywhere. In the United States, they begin to be seen as Europeanized, distant, trapped in an old world. In Europe, no matter how hard they try, they never quite become fully local. There is always an accent that does not disappear, a strange habit, a childhood anecdote from New York or Newport that reminds everyone they come from another social planet. The letters and memoirs that have come down to us, full of evasions, metaphors, and meaningful silences, hint at a constant mixture of privilege and sadness. They speak of brilliant dinners and also of sleepless nights, of trips to fashionable spas to rest their nerves, when, in reality, they are trying to hold together a fragile emotional balance. Many of them did not even have the psychological language we use today. They spoke of melancholy, distress, nervous attacks. Behind those old words, it is easy to recognize symptoms we would now call depression, anxiety, identity crisis. Motherhood adds another layer of complexity. The children of these marriages are born in Europe, speak their father's language effortlessly, are educated in British, French, or Italian schools, absorb customs that feel natural to them, and learn to their mothers. Certain scenes repeat themselves, an American mother trying to pass on memories of her childhood across the ocean, while her children feel more identified with English country life or the London social season than with summers in Newport. Sometimes the mother's very accent turns her, inside her own house, into a kind of permanent visitor. This distance can become painful when the children internalize the prejudices of their surroundings. Some grow up hearing disparaging comments about vulgar Americans, money without taste, people who do not know their place, without realizing they are talking, in part, about their own mother. She thus becomes a paradoxical figure, at once the source of their financial security and the target of a certain cultural disdain. No one needs to say it outright. Children sense the invisible hierarchy in every gesture, every joke, every silence. On the outside, everything still looks like a fairy tale: jewels, carriages, trips, receptions. On the inside, the feeling of living a life designed by others becomes harder and harder to ignore. From childhood, they had been told, with varying degrees of subtlety, that their mission was to make a good marriage. When that mission is accomplished, what is left of them? Where does the role end and the person begin? Many try to find refuges, some in religion, others in charitable causes, others in friendships outside the strict circle of the court. Some retreat into private writing, diaries they never thought would be read, where they let slip that sometimes the greatest fantasy was not the European palace, but a smaller house where none of this mattered. The simple desire to choose whom to be with, what to do with their time, what to wear without it being interpreted as a political statement. The contradiction is brutal. Objectively, they have everything. Subjectively, they feel they control almost nothing. They are at once admired and scrutinized, envied and pitied. Any gesture can become ammunition for the press or for drawing room gossip. A dress that is too modern, a political opinion slightly clearer than is acceptable, an inconvenient friendship. And suddenly, The next day's newspaper reduces them to caricature: the capricious American, the difficult wife, the duchess who does not understand her place. Seen from today, that tension feels oddly familiar. We may not live in palaces or hold titles, but the idea of a life designed from the outside rings a bell. Family expectations, social pressure, public image, even if it is just the shop window of a social network. The feeling that there is a script to follow. They lived it with whalebone corsets and candlelit dinners. We live it with screens and notifications. The scenery changes, but the underlying question is very similar. To what extent are we living the life we want, and to what extent the life others expect from us? Perhaps for that reason, when Hollywood and literature took hold of these stories, they chose a very specific angle. It was much easier to sell the public the image of the rich girl who marries a poor nobleman, the dances in gilded drawing rooms, the dazzling white dress, the carriage rolling away to applause. Much less appealing was to show the nights they could not sleep, the arguments in mixed languages, the moments of silent panic at the thought of being trapped forever in a role that no longer fit. Cinema kept the shine, not the cracks. Romantic novels turned marriages of convenience into stories of destined love. And for decades, the collective memory repeated the fantasy more than the reality. Recovering today the uncomfortable part, the psychological price, the split identities, is not about spoiling the fairy tale, but about completing it. Only then does it become clear that those heiresses were not just symbols of an economic exchange between two continents, but also the human reflection of a question we still ask ourselves: how much of our life is choice, and how much is the result of someone else's design we have accepted almost without realizing it? As time went by, something curious happened with the real stories of the American heiresses who crossed the Atlantic. They stopped being read as specific chapters of economic history and became material for romantic fiction. Hollywood, popular novels, and even certain society pages took that figure, the rich girl from New York who falls in love with a European aristocrat, and turned her into a universal archetype, recognizable even to those who knew absolutely nothing about the Gilded Age. The cinematic version of this story is easy to recognize: an independent young woman, a nobleman with a title but no luck, a chance meeting, a romance that overcomes prejudice, a final ball in a glittering ballroom. A structure that works very well on screen, precisely because it is almost the opposite of what actually happened historically. The real lives of these women had less magic and more negotiation, fewer thunderbolt romances, and more contracts drafted by lawyers and ambassadors, fewer shining crowns and more cold rooms where figures and expectations were discussed. Romantic literature repeated this pattern again and again. It was no longer about dollars for titles, but about two worlds meeting. Cultural tensions that in practice could destroy marriages became innocent narrative engines, amusing differences, sparks, charming misunderstandings. The clash between American spontaneity and European stiffness stopped being a structural problem and was turned into a mechanism for comedy or for the male protagonist's personal transformation. Over time, this trope, the American woman who conquers a foreign palace, became so popular that it transcended fiction. The press began to cover real stories as if they were episodes in a global romantic plot. Every wedding between a woman without a title and an aristocrat was presented as the new Cinderella, even when the backstory had nothing of a fairy tale. Family tensions were hidden beneath glittering headlines, financial arrangements vanished from the articles, and what remained was the collective fantasy that any woman anywhere could, with charm and luck, become a princess. That cliché went so far that it even survives today in modern formats. Reality shows that simulate castles and available princes, programs that play with the idea of a royal makeover, fantasies inviting the audience to imagine that the most extreme social ascent still happens through falling in love with someone with a hereditary title. Ironic when we consider that the 20th century demolished a good part of the real power of those same aristocracies. The distortion works because it offers a simplified version of the conflict. In films, true love defeats family pressure, class prejudice, cultural distance. In reality, it was almost always the other way around. Family pressure defeated love, the dowry defeated desire, strategy defeated instinct. And when there was love, it did not always survive the demands of a life locked inside other people's expectations. But if fiction softens the story, it also tells us something important: the human need to turn hard structures, economic, social, political, into stories we can understand and, if possible, admire. Myth transforms cold negotiations into warm passions because it is easier to tell and easier to believe. For decades, that myth has hidden the roughest layers of the real experience of these heiresses: loneliness, forced adaptation, guilt for not wanting the life others had chosen for them. Yet, when we look again at history, as we have done throughout this documentary, we discover that reality, though less glamorous, is far more interesting than fantasy. It has contradictions, tensions, impossible decisions. It does not fit into a fairy tale, but it illuminates far better how the world actually worked. A world where love stories could exist, yes, but almost always subordinate to politics, economics, and the crushing weight of surnames. And what is fascinating is that, beyond the fictions, these marriages left very concrete traces, not only in bloodlines and archives, but in buildings, gardens, institutions, and traditions that still stand today. There, among stone walls and complex genealogies, we can most clearly see what these unions really meant for Europe. Because no matter how much popular culture has preferred to tell the sugar-coated version, the physical legacy of these alliances, the restorations they paid for, the properties they saved, the foundations they supported, still speaks in a language far less romantic but infinitely more revealing. If today you buy a ticket to visit a certain kind of European palace, it is easy to assume they have always been there, solid, inevitable, as if time had flowed around them without ever touching them. But behind many of those perfect facades, those painted ceilings and symmetrical gardens, there are very specific stories of checks signed on the other side of the Atlantic, money that crossed the ocean hidden behind a wedding dress. Blenheim is a clear example. The visitor who walks through its rooms, its endless galleries, its portraits of ancestors, usually reads plaques about battles, dukes, military heroes. Sometimes, in a small line, there appears a name that does not quite match all those British surnames: Vanderbilt. There is no need to exaggerate. Without the money Consuelo brought, that palace's future would have been, at the very least, much more uncertain. Postponed renovations, unpaid debts, land sold off bit by bit. Stories that did indeed happen to other estates that did not have their rescuing heiress. And Blenheim is not alone. There are castles, country houses, town mansions in London, in Paris, on the French Riviera, whose current condition, open to the public, converted into luxury hotels, event venues, or simply well-preserved, is directly linked to that flow of American capital at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. Each dowry helped plug very real holes: leaks, mortgages, lawsuits with creditors, estates on the verge of foreclosure. The tourist wandering through those spaces is surrounded by a legacy that at times no one points out. Drawing rooms redecorated in a specific era, entire wings built or refurbished thanks to an advantageous marriage, gardens designed to impress not just local aristocracy, but international visitors. Without that injection of money, some of those places would have been subdivided, demolished, or transformed into something unrecognizable. At the same time, many of the tourist routes we now consider normal, castle circuits, visits to country seats, walks through aristocratic districts, are deeply crossed by these stories. Guides who tell light anecdotes about the American woman who arrived at court, souvenir shops selling postcards with their portraits, cafes set up where tea was once served to official visitors. Everything wrapped in a patina of charm, with the sharpest edges already smoothed over by time. At the same time, the legacy is not only architectural, it is also genealogical. American surnames that mixed with European lineages still appear from time to time in society magazines, at charity events, in occasional interviews. In some cases, descendants hold honorary positions in cultural institutions, museum boards, foundations that preserve precisely those buildings financed, in part, by their forebears. They no longer have the political power of the past, but they retain something more subtle: visibility, access, a certain capacity to decide what is preserved, what is told, and how it is told. There is a curious paradox in all this. For decades, those heiresses often felt trapped in palaces they did not feel were theirs, forced to maintain a lifestyle that responded more to the surname than to their desires. Today, people from all over the world queue to enter those same palaces, pay for a ticket, take photographs, perhaps comment on how romantic it must have been to live there. The intimate suffering of those who helped save those places dissolves into the broader story of architectural beauty and historic heritage. If we look at the present with a little distance, it is also clear that the underlying mechanism has not completely disappeared. What has changed is the form. Where once an indebted noble family sought a rich heiress to restore its house, today it may seek a deal with a luxury brand, with an investment fund, with a state willing to subsidize heritage conservation. Temporary exhibitions, film shoots, renting halls for weddings, agreements with five-star hotels, new ways of turning symbolic prestige into the income needed to maintain very expensive stones. The logic, however, is quite similar. Money in exchange for prestige, economic capital in exchange for symbolic capital. The American heiresses offered both at once, substantial checks and a touch of exotic modernity that got people talking. Today, that role is sometimes played by major brands wanting to associate their image with the idea of tradition, exclusivity, history. They do not wear tiaras, but they carry logos. They do not cross the Atlantic by ship, but in advertising campaigns. It is also true that many of the institutions that now benefit from this new wave of funding, museums, foundations, public bodies, are trying to rewrite the story, better integrating all these layers of history. They do not always succeed, but it is increasingly common to find explanations of who financed what, in what economic and political context, and with what implications. The American heiresses are beginning to recover a more complex place in the narrative. Neither angelic saviors nor mere victims, but actors in an unequal exchange that left deep marks. Meanwhile, there are still families who, discreetly, manage the legacy of those marriages. Private archives open to historians, personal diaries published decades later, memoirs that make it possible to understand more clearly what it meant to live at that intersection between two worlds. The surnames have changed accent, sometimes spelling. The fortunes have been diluted, divided, transformed. But the trail is still there, halfway between stone and paper. And perhaps the most striking thing is that, as we walk through these places, we rarely think about the phrase we have repeated several times throughout this documentary. American heiresses saved European royal families. We take it for granted, as a convenient summary. Yet when we look closely at the contracts, the marriages, the disasters averted, and the lives broken, the reality is much more ambiguous. Because, yes, there are intact palaces, tended gardens, lineages that survived thanks to those dowries. But there are also uncomfortable questions about who paid the highest price, what was truly saved, and what was lost along the way. And it is precisely in that space of doubt that the ultimate meaning of this whole story is decided. When we look back and try to sum up everything we have seen, it is tempting to settle for a simple sentence. American heiresses saved European royal families. It sounds good, it fits the period narrative, and there is some truth in it. Their dowries prevented the immediate collapse of dozens of noble houses, paid for restorations, cleared debts, rebuilt entire wings of palaces, and bought time for a system that had been showing deep cracks for decades. That money helped sustain structures that, without them, might have fallen much sooner. But if we look more closely, the story is not so neat. Because in that same process, those heiresses also supported, even if unintentionally, a declining social order, full of inflexible rules and hierarchies that resisted disappearing. A world in which the nobility desperately sought to preserve its image while its real power crumbled. In a way, those dowries acted like life support. They prolonged the life of a system that could no longer stand on its own. They also gained something. They entered historical circles that had previously been closed to them. They obtained titles, access, visibility. For some, it was a gateway to political or cultural influence. For others, a way to escape families that were just as rigid, though dressed in marble and electricity. For many, however, the deal was far less favorable. They gave up their freedom, their desires, and at times their emotional health in order to play a role others had written for them. That is why perhaps the real question is not whether they saved the European houses, but whether they were saviors or customers. Did they pay to enter a world that never really wanted them? Or did they rescue institutions that, without them, would have quietly disappeared from the map? Was it a fair exchange or an unequal contract in which one side put up the money and the other imposed the script? And here comes another inevitable question, aimed directly at you, the one listening. If you had been born in their place, would you have accepted that bargain? A title in exchange for your personal life? A palace in exchange for others deciding for you? A historic surname in exchange for renouncing your own choices? It is easy to say no from the present. It is harder to imagine oneself inside a world where social ascent did not depend on studying, starting a business, or choosing a trade, but on marriage. A world where your possibilities were trimmed from birth and where saying no could mean losing your entire position in society. And as we reflect on that, the story becomes even more current than it seems. Today, great fortunes still buy access to prestige, even though the stage has changed. They may not seek noble titles, but they do fund museums, give their names to universities, buy football clubs, invest in cultural foundations. The exchange between money and symbolism continues, although now it wears modern suits and uses corporate language. Alliances between elites, economic, political, media, still operate like strategic marriages, even if they no longer require ceremony. Perhaps then, what remains to us is not an answer, but one last critical look. Yes, American heiresses helped keep certain palaces from collapsing. Yes, they extended the life of a tottering aristocracy. Yes, they built bridges between two worlds that seemed opposed. But what they supported was not only stone, history, or tradition. They also supported a system of rigid hierarchies, imposed expectations, lives planned by others. A system that, in many ways, was already condemned by the changes that were coming: wars, revolutions, new economies, new ideas about the role of women. Perhaps that is why the final question is not really who saved whom, but another, more uncomfortable, broader, and more important one. What deserves to be saved? The palaces, the surnames, the traditions? Or the stories of those who, even with all the money in the world, had to pay a price they had never chosen to pay?